The night Imani Brooks stood barefoot on the cold marble steps of the Fox Theater in Atlanta, holding her ruined wedding ring in one fist and a torn invitation in the other, she heard her own husband laugh at her from inside the building. The laugh did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to Roland, the man she had cooked for, prayed for, and quietly carried for 11 long years. And he was laughing because the woman on his arm, a tall model in a red dress, had just whispered something cruel about Imani's plain cotton frock, the same frock he had told her to wear when she still believed she was going to be allowed inside. 2 hours earlier, Imani had been standing in front of the mirror in their bedroom, fastening her grandmother's old pearl earrings, when Roland walked in adjusting his bow tie. He did not look at her. He looked past her. He said, "Imani, baby, I've been thinking. The Peachtree Heritage Gala is big tonight. Cameras. The mayor. The Carter people. You should sit this one out." She had turned slowly, holding her breath. "Sit it out?" she asked. He shrugged like she had asked him about the weather. "You boring, baby. You always been boring. I love you, but tonight ain't your night. Stay home with Joel. Camille is coming with me. She knows how to move in those rooms." Camille. The name landed in Imani's chest like a stone dropped in still water. She did not cry. She had been raised by Grandma Ruth Brooks, and Grandma Ruth had not raised a crier. She had simply nodded, watched her husband walk down the hallway whistling, and listened as the front door of their Buckhead townhouse closed behind him. Then she had stood in the silence of that bedroom for a long time, staring at the dress laid out on the bed, the soft cream cotton dress with the small lace collar, the dress Grandma Ruth had sewn for her by hand the year before she passed. She had picked it up. She had put it on. She had braided her natural hair into a low crown around her head, the way Grandma Ruth used to braid it on Sunday mornings before church. She had slipped on her grandmother's pearl earrings, taken the small leather pouch from the top drawer where she kept the things that mattered, and walked out of that townhouse without telling a soul where she was going. Not her son Joel, who was asleep at her sister friend Della May's house for the weekend. Not Roland. Not anybody. She had driven herself to the Fox Theater in her dusty old farm truck, the one Roland refused to ride in. At the door, the security guard had taken one look at her cotton dress and her bare hands and asked to see her invitation. She had presented it. He had looked at the name, looked at her face, then looked back at the name. He had whispered into his earpiece. A man in a black suit had appeared. The man had said, very politely, that there must have been some confusion, that the invitation was no longer valid, that Mr. Roland Pierce had called ahead and asked that his +1 be amended, that his wife would not be attending, that a Miss Camille was on the list now. Imani had felt the heat rise up her neck, but her face had stayed still. She had asked, quietly, if she could speak to Mrs. Tova Green, the foundation chairwoman. The man in the black suit had laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either. He had said Mrs. Green was busy hosting the event of the year. He had said perhaps Imani could try again next year. He had gently, but firmly, asked her to step aside so the real guests could pass. That was when she had heard the laugh. Roland's laugh, coming through the open doors as he and Camille swept past her in a cloud of cologne and perfume. Camille had looked at Imani's dress, at her bare face, at her pearl earrings, and had said, just loud enough, Roland, your little wife thought it was a costume party. And Roland had laughed. He had not even looked at Imani. He had just laughed and walked his model right past his own wife of 11 years like she was a piece of furniture. Imani had stepped back from the door. She had walked down the marble steps. She had taken off her shoes, because they were Grandma Ruth's old church shoes, and the leather pinched. She had stood in the warm Atlanta night and listened to the music drift out of the Fox Theater. She had opened her small leather pouch. Inside was her phone, a folded letter, and a single sheet of cream-colored paper with a gold seal of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation pressed into the corner. The paper Mrs. Tova Green had sent her 3 weeks ago. The paper Roland had never seen. She had unfolded it. She had read the first line again. Dear Dr. Brooks, on behalf of the board, we are honored to formally invite you to be unveiled tonight as the Foundation's anonymous founding benefactor and incoming board chair. She had folded it back up. She had put her shoes back on. And then, very slowly, The corners of her mouth had lifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was not far from one either. She had turned around. She had walked back up the marble steps. The security guard had seen her coming and had moved to block her, but before he could open his mouth, the front doors had burst open from the inside, and Mrs. Tova Green herself, in a floor-length emerald gown, had rushed out with both hands stretched toward Imani. "Dr. Brooks," Tova had said, her voice loud enough that the entire entryway behind her had gone still. "Where on earth have you been? The whole board has been waiting on you. We cannot start the announcement without you. Please, please come in." And every head in the lobby of the Fox Theater had turned to look at the woman in the simple cotton dress, including Roland, including Camille. And in that moment, Imani Brooks understood that the worst night of her life was about to become the best one. But to understand how she had ended up on those marble steps and how she had come to hold that letter in her hand, you have to go back. You have to go all the way back to a peach orchard in Macon, Georgia, and a woman named Ruth Brooks who told her granddaughter, when she was only 7 years old, that one day she would own something the world could not take from her. And that day had finally come. But the night was just getting started. Long before there was a townhouse in Buckhead, before there was a husband named Roland, before there was even a city called Atlanta in Imani's mind, there was a wooden porch in Macon, Georgia, and a woman named Ruth Brooks sitting on it with a paring knife and a bowl of peaches. Imani's earliest memory was of that porch. She was 4 years old. Her mother had passed 2 months earlier from a sickness nobody fully explained to her, and her grandmother had taken her in without a word of complaint or a moment of hesitation. Grandma Ruth had simply opened the front door, picked Imani up, and said, "Come on now, baby. We got work to do." The work was the orchard. Ruth Brooks had inherited 80 acres of red Georgia soil from her own father in 1962, and on that soil she had planted peach trees. Not the big, commercial kind. The old kind. Heritage varieties with names like Belle of Georgia, Indian Blood, and Sun High. Trees her father had grown from cuttings passed down through the family since before her grandmother was born. By the time Imani came to live with her, Grandma Ruth had been working that orchard alone for almost 30 years. She wore a faded blue head wrap, a denim apron, and a smile that did not always reach her eyes, but always reached yours. Imani grew up among those trees. She learned to read by reading the seed catalogs at the kitchen table. She learned to count by counting bushels at harvest. She learned about God by listening to Grandma Ruth hum old hymns under her breath while she pruned the lower branches. The orchard was small and the money was always tight, but Grandma Ruth never complained. "Baby," she would say, "this land was bought with my daddy's sweat and watered with my mama's tears. As long as I am breathing, it stays in this family." When Imani was 7, she asked her grandmother what would happen to the orchard one day. Grandma Ruth had set down her paring knife. She had wiped her hands on her apron. She had taken Imani's small face in her 2 warm palms. She had said, "Baby girl, one day this orchard is going to be yours. And on that day, you are going to own something that nobody, not the bank, not a man, not the government, not even the devil himself, can take away from you. You hear me?" Imani had nodded, though she had not fully understood. She had only understood that her grandmother was a serious woman who did not say serious things lightly. School came easy to Imani. She was quiet but sharp. She finished top of her class at Central High in Macon, then went on to Spelman College in Atlanta on a full academic scholarship. She majored in economics. While the other girls in her dorm were going to step shows and homecomings, Imani was in the library reading about agricultural markets and soil chemistry and supply chain logistics. She wanted to know how a small orchard like Grandma Ruth's could survive in a world ruled by giant agribusiness. She wanted to know how a woman with 80 acres in Macon could matter. She went on to Emory for her PhD in agricultural economics. Her dissertation was about how Black-owned heritage farms in the American South could leverage scarcity and storytelling to compete with industrial producers. She wrote it late at night, in the library, drinking sweet tea from a thermos, while Grandma Ruth quietly battled cancer back home in Macon. Imani drove the 90 miles back to Macon every weekend. She would pull into the gravel driveway, find Grandma Ruth on the porch with her paring knife, and the two of them would sit and shell peas or peel peaches and talk about everything and nothing. Grandma Ruth passed the spring Imani turned 26. The funeral was small. The little church in Macon was packed wall to wall with people who had known Ruth Brooks all her life. Sister Della Mae Whitfield, Ruth's best friend of 50 years, sat next to Imani in the front pew and held her hand through the entire service. After the burial, when the mourners had gone home and the casseroles had been put in the fridge, Sister Della Mae and Imani had walked out into the orchard together. The trees were in full bloom. The whole 80 acres smelled like sweet pink heaven. "Baby," Sister Della Mae had said, "your grandmama left you everything. The land, the house, the trees, the trucks, the recipes. She left it all to you. What you fixing to do with it?" Imani had stood very still. She had looked out across the rows of trees her great-grandfather had planted with his own hands. She had felt the warm Macon breeze move through her braids. She had thought about her grandmother's promise. Own something the world cannot take from you. She had turned to Sister Della Mae and she had said, very quietly, "Della Mae, I am going to build this into something Grandma Ruth would be proud of. And I am going to do it so quiet, nobody will even know it is me, until I am ready for them to know." Sister Della Mae had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had nodded once. "All right, baby. All right. I'm with you. What you need me to do." Imani had smiled. The first real smile since the funeral. "Stay. Run the orchard with me. Be my farm manager. I'll handle the business side from Atlanta. We do this together." Sister Della Mae had pulled her into a hug that smelled like peach cobbler and Sunday lotion. Together, baby. Together. That had been 12 years ago. 12 years of quiet, steady, careful work. 12 years of building Brooks Heritage Orchards into one of the most respected boutique fruit brands in the American South, all of it hidden behind a holding company nobody in Atlanta society had ever bothered to look up. 12 years of Imani driving back to Macon every weekend in her dusty old farm truck, while Roland Pierce, the husband she had met during her PhD program, told everyone at his real estate firm that his wife was just a sweet little stay-at-home wife who liked to garden. 12 years of Imani letting him say it. 12 years of being underestimated. 12 years that had been quietly building, day by day, toward the night she would finally step into the light. And now, somewhere between a marble step and a foundation chairwoman's outstretched hands, that night had finally arrived. Imani had met Roland Pierce in her last year of graduate school at Emory. She had been 28, exhausted, and quietly grieving the still-fresh loss of her grandmother. He had been 32, already 3 years into his career as a junior associate at a downtown Atlanta real estate firm, and he had walked into the campus coffee shop one rainy October afternoon looking, in her own words later, like a man who had decided what kind of life he wanted and was simply waiting for the right woman to walk into it. He had been charming in the beginning. There was no denying that. He had held doors. He had brought her flowers from the cart outside the MARTA station. He had laughed at her jokes, even the quiet ones. He had told her on their third date that he liked that she was different, that she wasn't loud, that she wasn't always trying to be the center of attention, that she made him feel calm. Imani had been flattered. She had been a young woman who had lost her only family, was deep into a difficult dissertation, and had been quietly running an orchard from a dorm room. The idea of someone wanting to take care of her, even a little, had felt like a soft place to land. They had married 18 months later in a small ceremony at New Mount Olive Baptist Church in Macon. Pastor Eunice Holloway had officiated. Sister Della Mae had stood as her matron of honor. Imani had worn her grandmother's old wedding pearls and a simple ivory dress she had sewn herself, working on it at the kitchen table in Macon in the evenings after dissertation work. Roland had told her, kindly, that she should hire a designer next time. There would be many photographs in their lives, he had said, and she should always look her best. The trouble had started small. So small Imani had not even noticed at first. He had not liked when she wore her hair in its natural coils. He had asked her, very sweetly at first, if she would consider getting it straightened. It would look more professional, he had said. It would suit her face better. She had let it go. She had pulled it back into a low bun and not said anything. He had not liked her old farm truck. He had asked her, again very sweetly, if she would consider getting something more appropriate for a wife of his. Something a little more polished. She had let that go too, except for the weekend trips to Macon, when she had quietly kept driving the truck because no Buick was going to haul peach crates. He had not liked her clothes. He had not liked her quiet way of speaking. He had not liked how often she went home to Macon. He had not liked her church. He had not liked that she did not drink at his work parties. He had not liked that she would rather read a book than go to a club. He had a list, it seemed, of all the small ways she did not measure up, and over the years that list had grown longer and longer, until one day Imani had realized, with the kind of clarity that only comes in a quiet kitchen at 2 in the morning, that her husband did not actually like her at all. He liked the idea of being married. He did not like her. But by then, Joel had been born, their son, a quiet, watchful little boy with his mother's deep brown eyes and her grandmother's calm way of moving through the world. Joel had loved the orchard from the first time Imani took him there as a baby. He would sit on a quilt under the peach trees and watch the leaves move in the wind for hours. Sister Della May had said, holding him on her hip one summer afternoon, "This boy is Ruth Brooks come back around. Look at how still he is. Look at how he watches." And Imani, watching her son, had felt the strangest mix of joy and sorrow because she had known, even then, that the marriage was going to fail. She had simply not known when. Roland did not like the orchard. He had visited once, early in their marriage. He had walked the rows in a pair of expensive Italian loafers, gotten red Georgia dust on them, and never come back. He had told Imani that her little hobby was sweet, but that she should consider letting it go. The land, he said, would be worth more sold to developers. There was talk of new subdivisions out that way. She could make a clean 6 figures and put it away for Joel's college. She had smiled, very small and very tight, and said she would think about it. She had not thought about it. She had simply never told him another word about the orchard. What she had not told him over the years was that the orchard was thriving, that she had launched a boutique brand called Brooks Heritage Orchards under a holding company in 2014, that her peaches, packed in handsome wooden crates with her grandmother's handwriting reproduced on the labels, were now sold in Whole Foods locations across 6 states, that her preserves were on the menu at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants in Atlanta, that Delta Airlines had a private contract with her for their international first-class meal service, that she had bought 120 additional acres adjacent to the original orchard, that she paid Sister Della May a 6-figure salary as farm manager, that she had a trust fund set up for Joel that would put him through any college he could imagine. None of it. He knew none of it. 3 weeks before the gala, a thick cream-colored envelope had arrived at Imani's Macon post office box. Inside had been a handwritten letter from Mrs. Tova Green, chairwoman of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation. The foundation, which funded heritage agriculture and Black-owned farms across Georgia, had been quietly funded for the past 8 years by an anonymous donor. That donor was Imani. Mrs. Green had recently discovered, through a chain of legal filings, who the donor actually was. The letter had asked Imani, very respectfully, to consider being unveiled at the annual gala as the foundation's founding benefactor and to step into the role of board chair. The letter had ended with a single line, "Dr. Brooks, the time has come for the world to know your name." Imani had folded the letter. She had carried it in her purse for 3 weeks, thinking. She had prayed about it on her knees, beside her bed. She had called Pastor Eunice Holloway and asked for counsel. Pastor Eunice had said, very gently, "Baby, the Lord does not give you a gift to hide it forever. There is a season to be hidden, and there is a season to be seen. Only you can know when one season ends and the next begins." Imani had hung up the phone. She had walked into her bedroom. She had laid the letter in the top drawer next to her grandmother's pearls. She had decided, that very moment, that she would attend the gala. She had not told Roland. She had not told anyone. And then, 3 days before the gala, Roland had walked into their bedroom adjusting his bow tie and told her she was too boring to go. The cream-colored letter had still been in the top drawer. He had still not known. And in the silence of that moment, Imani had felt her grandmother's voice rise up inside her, soft and clear. "The time, baby. The time has come. Camille Reeves was 26 years old, 6 feet tall in her flats, and had a face the camera loved from every angle. She had grown up in a small town outside of Birmingham, Alabama, the oldest of 4 children, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs at the hospital. Camille had been the pretty one in her family. Everybody had said so. Her grandmother had pinched her cheek when she was little and said, "Baby, that face is going to take you places." And from the time she was 13 years old, Camille had been working toward those places with the single-minded focus of a girl who had watched her mother come home too tired to take off her shoes. She had moved to Atlanta at 19 with $800 and a suitcase. She had walked into every modeling agency in the city. Most had turned her away. One had signed her. For 7 years she had hustled. Local catalog work, hair salon billboards, a few national campaigns. She had paid her bills, but only just. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in West End with 2 roommates. She sent half of every paycheck home to her mother in Alabama. She knew, by the time she was 25, that her window was closing. Atlanta was full of beautiful young women, and they were arriving every day, younger and hungrier than the one before. She had met Roland Pierce 6 months earlier at a real estate launch party for a new luxury condominium tower in Midtown. She had been hired by the developer as a hostess for the evening, in a tight black cocktail dress with a little gold lapel pin. Roland had walked up to her at the bar, ordered her a drink she had not asked for, and started talking. He had been smooth. He had been older. He had been married, and he had told her so right away, but he had said it with the casual air of a man who treated marriage like a sport coat he could take off when the weather was warm. Camille had not been impressed, but she had been tired and lonely, and curious about the kind of life a man like Roland could open a door to. They had started seeing each other quietly. Dinners in private rooms at restaurants in Sandy Springs. Weekend trips to Charleston that he billed as business travel. He had bought her things. A handbag from Phipps Plaza. A pair of earrings from a jeweler in Buckhead. He had told her that his wife was sweet but boring. He had said his wife was a homebody who had no interest in his world. He had said his wife did not understand him. He had said all the things married men say to younger women, and Camille, even though she had known better, had let herself believe some of it. Not because she loved Roland. She did not. But because she had been 26 and tired, and the idea that a man with money might take her seriously had felt like a soft place to land. When Roland had invited her to the Peachtree Heritage Gala, Camille had understood it was a turning point. He had told her there would be cameras. He had told her the right people would see her. He had told her that this was the kind of room where a young woman could meet her future, and that she should dress to be remembered. She had spent 3 weeks of savings on the red dress. She had spent 2 more weeks calling in favors with a hairstylist in Vine City. She had practiced walking in the heels in her apartment until 2 in the morning. When the night came, she had felt, for the first time in a long time, that her life might be about to change. What Camille had not known, as she stepped out of the Uber in front of the Fox Theater that night with her hand looped through Roland's elbow, was that Roland had told his actual wife to stay home only that very afternoon. She had assumed, when Roland had said his wife was not interested in his world, that he had told the wife about Camille months ago. She had assumed they had some kind of arrangement. She had not assumed she was being paraded as the replacement for a woman who did not even know she was being replaced. Camille was a lot of things, but she was not, fundamentally, a cruel person. She was a tired person who had made some tired decisions. So when she had walked up to the doors of the Fox Theater and seen the small black woman in the cotton dress standing in the entryway, holding an invitation in her hand, and looking at Roland with eyes that were not angry but were the worst thing eyes could be, which was disappointed, Camille had felt a small cold thing settle in her chest. She had said her cruel little line about the costume party because she had been nervous and embarrassed, and her mother had not raised her to be embarrassed in public, and saying something cruel had felt easier than saying nothing at all. But the moment the words had left her mouth, she had wanted to take them back. Roland had laughed. He had laughed loud enough for the woman in the cotton dress to hear. He had laughed, and he had pulled Camille past his own wife of 11 years, and Camille had felt the cold thing in her chest grow until it was the size of her whole heart. She had let herself be pulled into the lobby of the Fox Theater. She had let Roland hand her a glass of champagne. She had let him introduce her to a man in a navy suit as his date for the evening, with no mention of a wife, no mention of an 11-year marriage, no mention of the woman who had just been turned away at the door. But Camille had not been able to drink the champagne. She had stood there with the glass in her hand, smiling the way her mother had taught her to smile, and inside, she had been thinking about her own mother. She had been thinking about all the years her mother had worked 2 jobs at the hospital. She had been thinking about the time she was 16 and a man in a nice car had pulled up beside her at a gas station and offered her a ride, and her mother had snatched her by the arm and said, "Baby, listen to me. A man who will hurt another woman to get to you will hurt you to get to the next one. Do not ever forget that. Do not ever, ever forget that." Camille had set the champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray. She had looked at Roland, who was now talking very loudly to a small group of men about a real estate deal she did not understand. She had thought about turning around and walking out of the Fox Theater right then. She had almost done it. And then the front doors had burst open, and Mrs. Tova Green, in her emerald gown, had come rushing past her, calling out a name Camille did not recognize. "Dr. Brooks. Dr. Brooks, where on earth have you been? The whole board has been waiting." Camille had turned, slowly, to watch Mrs. Green reach out for the woman in the cotton dress. The woman Roland had laughed at. The woman with the pearl earrings. The wife. And in that moment, Camille had known, with the terrible certainty of a girl who had watched her mother work too hard for too long, that whatever was about to happen in the lobby of the Fox Theater was going to be the kind of thing she would remember for the rest of her life. To understand how Mrs. Tova Green had come to be running across the lobby of the Fox Theater toward a small woman in a cotton dress, you have to go back 8 years, to a different night, and a different kind of letter. It was 2018, and Mrs. Tova Green had just been named chairwoman of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation. The foundation had been founded in 1971 by a group of old Atlanta families who wanted to preserve Georgia's agricultural heritage, but by 2018 the foundation had been struggling. Funds were low. The mission had grown tired. The grant programs for Black-owned heritage farms, which had been the foundation's original purpose, had been quietly defunded for nearly a decade. Mrs. Tova Green had been 45 years old that year, the youngest chairwoman in the foundation's history, and she had been determined to bring the original mission back to life. She had spent her first 3 months in the role writing grant proposals to every wealthy family in Georgia. She had been turned down by all of them. She had been sitting in her office on a Tuesday evening, the November rain falling on Peachtree Street outside her window, when her assistant had walked in with a single envelope. No return address. Inside had been a cashier's check for $200,000 and a single sheet of paper that read, "For the Heritage Farm Grant Program. Please do not attempt to identify the donor. There will be more." There had been more. Every 6 months for 8 years, an envelope had arrived. Sometimes $100,000. Sometimes 2. Once, after a particularly devastating hurricane had wiped out half the small farms in southwest Georgia, the envelope had contained a check for $1 million. Mrs. Tova Green had honored the donor's wish for anonymity. She had not investigated. She had not asked questions. She had simply used the money to do what the donor had asked her to do, which was to fund Black-owned heritage farms across the state of Georgia. And over those 8 years, the foundation had transformed. It had become one of the most respected agricultural foundations in the American South. Mrs. Tova Green had been written about in the New York Times. She had been invited to speak at the White House. And not once in 8 years had she known the name of the woman who had made it all possible. Until 3 months before the gala. A young lawyer at her firm had been doing routine due diligence on the foundation's finances and had stumbled, by accident, on a chain of holding companies. The lawyer had followed the chain, and at the end of it had been a single name, Dr. Imani Brooks, of Macon, Georgia, owner of Brooks Heritage Orchards. The lawyer had brought the file to Mrs. Tova Green. Mrs. Tova Green had sat at her desk for a long time. She had read the file twice. She had looked up Dr. Imani Brooks online. She had found almost nothing. A single old photograph from a Spelman alumni newsletter. A short bio on a soil science conference website. No social media. No press. No nothing. And yet this woman had quietly given the foundation more than $7 million over 8 years. Mrs. Tovagreen had picked up the phone and called the number listed in the file. A woman had answered on the second ring. Brooks Heritage Orchards, this is Imani speaking. Mrs. Tovagreen had introduced herself. There had been a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Imani had said, very quietly, I assume you found me. Mrs. Tovagreen had said, yes, ma'am. I found you, and I would like to drive down to Macon this weekend if you would allow me to meet you in person. Imani had said yes. That Saturday, Mrs. Tovagreen had driven the 90 miles to Macon and had sat on the same wooden porch where Grandma Ruth Brooks had once peeled peaches and had listened to Imani tell the story of her life. Imani had told her about her grandmother, about the 80 acres, about the heritage varieties, about the dissertation, about the holding company, about the slow, patient years of building the orchard into a brand, about her son Joel. She had not told Mrs. Tovagreen about Roland. Not at first. Mrs. Tovagreen had asked, near the end of the afternoon, why Imani had stayed hidden for so long. Imani had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, because my grandmother told me that one day I would own something nobody could take from me. And I needed to be sure I had truly built it before I let anyone know it existed. Mrs. Tovagreen had nodded. She had understood. They had talked, then, about what would come next. Mrs. Tovagreen had asked Imani if she would consider stepping out of the shadows. The foundation, she had said, was at a turning point. It needed a public face, a real leader. It needed someone whose own life embodied the mission. It needed her. And Imani had said, I will think about it. I will pray about it. I will let you know. 3 weeks later, the cream-colored envelope had arrived at her Macon post office box. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Imani had wrestled with the decision the way her grandmother had taught her to wrestle with hard things. On her knees, in her kitchen, in long quiet walks through the orchard. She had talked to Pastor Eunice Holloway. She had talked to Sister Della Mae. She had even talked to little Joel in her own simple way, asking him if it was all right if Mama was on the news sometimes. Joel had looked up from his coloring book and said, Mama, are you going to be famous? And she had said, no, baby. I am just going to stop being invisible. And Joel had nodded gravely and said, okay, Mama. I think that is a good idea. What she had not done in any of those weeks was tell Roland. She had thought many times about telling him. She had thought about how it might change things. She had thought about how he might react. And every time, she had felt a small cold thing settle in her chest, and she had known, without quite knowing how she knew, that telling Roland would not make things better. Telling Roland would make things worse. Telling Roland would mean handing him a piece of her grandmother's legacy, and she had promised her grandmother, on that wooden porch when she was 7 years old, that she would not hand the orchard to anyone who did not love it. So she had kept her secret. She had RSVP'd quietly to Mrs. Tovagreen. She had told Sister Della Mae to come to Atlanta the night of the gala, just in case. She had laid out her grandmother's cotton dress. She had pressed her grandmother's pearl earrings. She had folded the cream-colored letter and placed it in her small leather pouch. And then Roland had walked into their bedroom and told her she was too boring to come. And Imani had felt her grandmother's voice rise up inside her, soft and clear and certain. Asterisk the time, baby. The time has come. Asterisk, she had let him walk out the door. She had picked up her keys. And she had driven her dusty old farm truck through the warm Atlanta evening, toward the Fox Theater, toward the rest of her life, with no idea, none at all, that her husband had already called ahead to make sure she would not be allowed inside. The drive from the Buckhead townhouse to the Fox Theater on Peachtree Street was only 7 miles, but on the evening of the gala, those 7 miles felt to Imani Brooks like the longest drive of her life. She had pulled out of her driveway just as the streetlights were coming on. The October air was warm and soft, the kind of Atlanta evening that smells faintly of magnolia and exhaust fumes and something else, something older, something that reminded her of Macon. She had rolled down the windows of her old farm truck. She had let the wind move through her braids. She had not turned on the radio. Instead, she had let herself think. She had thought, first, about her grandmother. About the day Grandma Ruth had taken her face in her two warm palms and told her about owning something the world could not take from her. Imani had been 7 years old that day. She had not understood, at 7, what her grandmother had meant. She had simply understood that her grandmother was a serious woman who did not say serious things lightly. But sitting in her old farm truck at 38 years old, driving toward the Fox Theater with her grandmother's pearls in her ears and her grandmother's letter in her pouch, she had finally understood. Her grandmother had not been talking about land. She had not been talking about money. She had not been talking about a business. She had been talking about something deeper than that. She had been talking about a foundation. A self. A thing inside a person that did not depend on a husband, or a job, or a public opinion, or a man's good mood. A thing that belonged only to the person who had built it. Grandma Ruth had built hers out of 80 acres of red Georgia soil and a paring knife and 50 years of stubborn faith. And Imani had built hers, quietly, over 12 long years, out of soil science and patience, and the slow, steady work of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was too quiet to matter. She had thought, next, about her son Joel, about the way he sat on the quilt under the peach trees and watched the leaves, about the way he ate her cobbler with his whole face, about the way he had said to her, only that morning, before she had dropped him off at Sister Delamay's for the weekend, "Mama, are you going to be okay tonight?" She had crouched down in the driveway to look him in the eyes. She had said, "Baby, I am going to be just fine. Why do you ask?" And Joel, 8 years old with eyes too old for his face, had said, "Because Daddy was being mean to you again at breakfast. And I did not like it." Imani had felt something break, very quietly, in her chest. She had pulled her son into her arms. She had said, "Joel, you listen to Mama. Mama is not going to let anyone be mean to her anymore. Mama is done with that. Mama is going to be the kind of woman you will be proud to call your mama for the rest of your life. You hear me?" Joel had nodded against her shoulder. He had said, very small, "I am already proud of you, Mama." And Imani, on her knees in the driveway, had cried for the first time in a very long time. Just for a moment. Just enough to wash something old out of her chest. Then she had wiped her face, put Joel in the car, and driven him to Sister Delamay's. Sister Della May had taken one look at Imani and known. She had not asked questions. She had simply pulled Joel out of the car, set him on her hip, and said to Imani, "Baby, I will see you tonight at the Fox. I'll be there at 7. I'll wear my green dress. You just do what you got to do." Imani had nodded. She had not been able to speak. She had simply driven away with Joel waving at her from Sister Delamay's porch, and now, hours later, driving toward the Fox Theater alone, she had let herself feel the full weight of everything she was about to do. Because what she was about to do, she had understood, was not really about Roland. It was not about Camille. It was not even about the foundation, or the announcement, or the cameras. It was about her grandmother. It was about her son. It was about every black woman who had ever been told she was too quiet, too plain, too country, too boring, too dark, too soft, too anything to be allowed to take up space in the rooms where decisions were made. It was about owning something the world could not take from her. And it was about, finally, after 12 long years of being underestimated, walking into a room and letting herself be seen. She had thought then about her marriage. About the man she had married 11 years ago, at New Mount Olive Baptist Church. She had tried, very hard, to remember the version of Roland she had fallen in love with. The young man who had brought her flowers from the MARTA station. The young man who had laughed at her quiet jokes. The young man who had told her she made him feel calm. She had tried, and she had not been able to find him. He was gone. He had been gone for a long time. The man who had walked out of their bedroom that afternoon adjusting his bow tie was not the man she had married. He was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his wife was a domestic accessory. She had thought about the years she had spent making herself small for him, the hair she had pulled back, the clothes she had toned down, the opinions she had swallowed, the accomplishments she had hidden. She had thought about how she had told herself, every time, that she was being a good wife. A patient wife. A Christian wife. She had thought about Pastor Eunice Holloway, who had once said to her very gently after a Wednesday night service, "Baby, there is a difference between being patient and being a doormat. Make sure you know which one you are practicing." Imani had not been able to answer Pastor Eunice that night. Driving toward the Fox Theater now, she finally could. I was being a doormat, Pastor. I see it now. But I am not going to be one anymore, asterisk. She had pulled into the public parking lot 2 blocks from the Fox Theater. She had killed the engine. She had sat for a long moment in the warm darkness of her old farm truck, the truck Roland had hated, the truck that had hauled her grandmother's peaches and her grandmother's caskets and her grandmother's whole long life. She had touched her grandmother's pearls. She had touched her grandmother's letter. She had taken 3 slow breaths, the way Grandma Ruth had taught her to do before a difficult conversation. And then, in the quiet of that parking lot, with her hands resting on the steering wheel, she had said out loud, just for her grandmother to hear, "Grandma, I'm going in." And she had stepped out of the truck. She had not known yet that her own husband had called ahead to make sure she would not be allowed inside. She had not known yet that she was about to be turned away at the door by a man in a black suit. She had simply walked toward the marble steps of the Fox Theater, the gala lights shining ahead of her, and she had carried her grandmother with her every step of the way. The lobby of the Fox Theater had gone completely still. Beverly and Crawford, society columnist for Atlanta Living Quarterly, was the first to lower her champagne glass. She had been standing near the gilded archway, halfway through story about a Buckhead divorce, when she had heard Mrs. Tova Green's voice cut clean across the room. Dr. Brooks. Dr. Brooks, where on earth have you been? Beverly, and had turned slowly. She had watched the chairwoman of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation, in a $4,000 emerald gown, take both hands of a small black woman in a plain cotton dress. She had felt, in that moment, the kind of professional thrill she had not felt in nearly 20 years on the society beat. Something was happening. Something real. Imani had let Mrs. Tova Green pull her into the lobby. She had not looked at Roland. She had not looked at Camille. She had simply walked, one foot in front of the other, the way her grandmother had taught her to walk when she was scared. Head up, baby. Shoulders back. Slow steps. The Lord is your shepherd. You shall not want. Mrs. Tova Green had been talking the whole way, her voice low and steady. Dr. Brooks, I am so sorry. There was a mix-up at the door. Someone changed your name on the list this afternoon. I have already had 3 words with security. It will not happen again. Imani had said, very quietly, it was not security. It was my husband. Mrs. Tova Green had stopped walking. She had looked at Imani. She had said, your husband. Imani had nodded once. Mrs. Tova Green had looked across the lobby. She had spotted Roland, who was now standing very still by the bar, his hand frozen around a tumbler of bourbon, watching his wife being escorted across the Fox Theater lobby by the most powerful philanthropist in the state of Georgia. Mrs. Tova Green had looked back at Imani. She had said, in a voice that was no longer low or steady, well, we will deal with that in due course. She had walked Imani to a small private alcove off the main lobby, where a hairstylist named Patrice and a young woman with a steamer had been quietly waiting since 6 o'clock. Mrs. Tova Green had clapped her hands together, twice. Patrice. Dr. Brooks's hair. As we discussed. Quick now. Patrice, a tall woman with locks down to her waist, had smiled at Imani like they had been friends for years. Dr. Brooks, baby, sit down. Tova told me everything. I got you. 2 minutes. Just a touch-up to that crown braid. You did beautiful work yourself. Imani had sat. She had let Patrice's warm hands move through her hair. She had felt, for the first time all evening, something inside her start to settle. Mrs. Tova Green had stepped just outside the alcove. She had made 1 phone call, then a second. Then she had come back in, just as Patrice finished pinning the last edge of the crown braid into place. Mrs. Tova Green had looked Imani up and down. She had said, Dr. Brooks, that dress is more beautiful than anything else in this building tonight. Don't you let anybody tell you different. Imani had touched the soft cotton with her fingertips. My grandmother sewed it for me, she had said. Mrs. Tova Green had nodded slowly. Then your grandmother is going to have the best seat in the house tonight. Out in the main lobby, the story had already begun to spread. Beverly and Crawford had not moved from her spot near the gilded archway, but she had quietly opened the small notebook she carried in her clutch and had begun to write. She had watched Roland Pierce, the real estate vice president, set his bourbon down on the bar with a hand that was not quite steady. She had watched the model in the red dress take one step away from him, then another. She had watched a wave of whispers move through the crowd like wind through a wheat field. Asterisk, did you see? Tova went running. The woman in the cotton dress. Did you hear what she called her? Dr. Brooks. Who is Dr. Brooks? Asterisk. Roland had not moved from the bar. His mind had been working very fast. He had been trying to understand what he was seeing. He had been trying to understand how his quiet, boring wife, who had been told that very afternoon that she was not welcome at this gala, had come to be standing in a private alcove with the chairwoman of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation, while Patrice, the celebrity stylist, did her hair. He had not been able to make sense of it. None of the pieces had fit together. And in the part of him that had still been honest, in the part that had remembered the young woman he had married 11 years ago at New Mount Olive Baptist Church, there had been a small cold thought rising up from the bottom of his mind. Asterisk, I do not know my wife. I have never known my wife. Asterisk. Camille had stepped fully away from Roland by then. She had crossed the lobby and taken a seat on a velvet bench near the coat check, and she had taken off her heels, because they had been killing her feet, and because she had needed to feel the cool marble floor under her bare toes. She had watched the woman in the cotton dress emerge from the private alcove on Mrs. Tova Green's arm. The crown braid had been freshly shined. The pearl earrings had caught the light. And Camille had thought, with the strange clarity of a tired girl who has finally seen something true, asterisk, that is a beautiful woman. That is the most beautiful woman in this room. Asterisk. At 7:15, Sister Della Mae Whitfield had walked through the front doors of the Fox Theater in her good green dress, with her good purse on her arm, and had walked straight past the security guard, who had taken one look at her face and decided not to ask any questions. Sister Della Mae had spotted Imani across the lobby. She had walked, with the slow, steady, unhurried walk of a 66-year-old black woman who had raised 4 children, buried a husband, and run an orchard with her best friend's granddaughter for 12 years, straight up to Imani and Mrs. Tova Green. She had taken Imani's free hand. She had squeezed it. She had said only, "I'm here, baby." Mrs. Tova Green had checked her wristwatch. She had looked at Imani. She had said, "Dr. Brooks, we need to take our seats. The dinner is about to be served. The announcement comes at 9. Are you ready?" Imani had taken a slow breath. She had felt Sister Della Mae's hand in her left hand, warm and steady. She had felt the cream-colored letter in her small leather pouch, pressed against her hip. She had felt her grandmother's pearls in her ears. She had thought about Joel, asleep at Sister Della Mae's house in his pajamas. She had thought about a wooden porch in Macon and a paring knife and a bowl of peaches. She had looked across the lobby at her husband, who was standing very still by the bar, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. And she had said, very quietly, "Mrs. Green, I am ready. Take me in." The grand ballroom of the Fox Theater held 700 people that night. The tables were dressed in deep peach and gold. The centerpieces were small wooden crates of heritage peaches, although not one person in the room had yet realized why. The ceiling was painted to look like a starlit Egyptian sky, the way it had been since 1929, and the soft uplights along the walls made the room glow like a warm dream. At 7:30, the 700 guests took their seats. The mayor of Atlanta sat at table 3. 2 members of the Carter family sat at table 5. Roland Pierce had been assigned to table 42, near the back, with Camille. Imani Brooks had been assigned to the head table, table 1, beside Mrs. Tova Green. Roland had not understood his table assignment when the printed cards had been distributed. He had been promised, when he had bought the tickets 6 months earlier, a prime seat. He had paid $5,000 per plate. He had been told he would be near the mayor. Instead, he had been moved to a table by the rear entrance, beside a couple who owned a small chain of dry cleaners in Decatur. Camille had not minded. Camille, in fact, had quietly excused herself from table 42 5 minutes after sitting down and had gone to the ladies' room. She had not returned. By the time the salad course was served, Roland was sitting at table 42 by himself. At the head table, Imani had eaten her dinner slowly. She had answered Mrs. Tova Green's questions in her soft, careful way. She had been introduced to a dozen people whose faces she would not remember by the end of the night. She had let Sister Delamay, who had been quietly upgraded to the head table by Mrs. Tova Green's intervention, hold her hand under the tablecloth whenever the room got too loud. She had not looked at table 42. Not once. She had not needed to. She had felt her husband watching her from the back of the room, and she had simply, for the first time in her marriage, not cared. At 8:45, Mrs. Tova Green had stepped to the podium at the front of the ballroom. The chandeliers had dimmed. A single warm spotlight had found her. She had welcomed the guests. She had thanked the foundation board. She had given the brief, gracious remarks that the foundation's chairwoman always gave at the annual gala. And then, at exactly 9 o'clock, she had paused. She had set down her note cards. She had looked out at the 700 upturned faces. And she had said in her steady, beautiful voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, the Peachtree Heritage Foundation has a story to tell you. A story that has been hidden for 8 years. And tonight, with the permission of the woman at the heart of it, we are finally going to tell it." The room had gone quiet. Mrs. Tova Green had begun. She had told them about the foundation's struggles in 2018. She had told them about the rainy November Tuesday when the first anonymous envelope had arrived. She had told them about the cashier's check for $200,000. She had told them about the 8 years of envelopes that had followed. She had told them about the $7 million. She had told them about every grant the foundation had been able to make because of those envelopes. The young farmer in Albany, Georgia, who had saved his family's pecan orchard. The widow in Sapelo Island, who had preserved her family's Sea Island cotton. The brothers in Cordial, who had revived their grandfather's watermelon farm. One after another, the stories had rolled out across the room. The 700 guests had not moved. The waitstaff had stopped clearing plates. The cameras at the back of the room had quietly turned themselves on. Beverly and Crawford had been writing so fast in her notebook that her hand had cramped. At the head table, Imani had been sitting very still. Sister Della May had still been holding her hand under the tablecloth. Mrs. Tova Green had told the room, finally, that 3 months ago, the foundation had discovered the identity of the anonymous benefactor. She had told the room that the benefactor was a black woman, a Georgia native, a graduate of Spelman and Emory, an agricultural economist, the owner of one of the most respected boutique fruit brands in the American South. A woman, she had said, whose own grandmother had founded an 80-acre heritage orchard in Macon, Georgia, in 1962, and whose granddaughter had taken that orchard and quietly, over 12 years, built it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise without ever once seeking the spotlight. Mrs. Tova Green had paused. The warm spotlight had widened. It had moved, slowly, away from the podium and across the ballroom, until it had landed on the head table. On Imani. The whole room had turned. 700 faces. The mayor. The Carter family. The members of the foundation board. Beverly and Crawford with her notebook open. And at the back of the room, at table 42, Roland Pierce, alone with an empty seat beside him, his face the color of ash. Mrs. Tova Green had said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming, for the very first time as the public face of this foundation, Dr. Imani Brooks of Brooks Heritage Orchards, founding benefactor, incoming board chair, and the woman who has quietly carried us all on her shoulders for 8 years." The applause had started slow. It had built. It had become a standing ovation. 700 people on their feet in the grand ballroom of the Fox Theater, applauding the small woman in the cotton dress and the pearl earrings who had just risen, slowly, from her seat at table 1. Imani had stood. She had felt Sister Della May's hand let go of hers. She had walked, in her grandmother's old church shoes, the long carpeted aisle to the podium. She had stepped up beside Mrs. Tova Green. She had touched the microphone. She had looked out at the 700 faces. She had not looked at table 42. Not yet. She had said, very quietly, "Good evening. My name is Imani Brooks, and I would like to tell you about my grandmother." She had told them. She had told them about Ruth Brooks and the 80 acres, about the paring knife and the bowl of peaches, about the wooden porch, about the day a 7-year-old girl had been promised something the world could not take from her. She had told them about Spellman and Emery and the holding company. She had told them about Sister Della, May, and 12 years of quiet work. She had told them about Joel. She had told them why she had stayed hidden. Because she had said her grandmother had taught her that there was a season to be hidden and a season to be seen, and that only the woman in the mirror could know when one season ended and the next began. She had finished. She had stepped back from the podium. The applause had risen again, louder this time, full of something that was not just admiration but something deeper, something that felt to Beverly and Crawford, in her 35 years on the society beat, like the entire city of Atlanta had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of leader. And in the middle of that applause, in the middle of the standing ovation, Imani had finally, slowly, deliberately, turned her head and looked all the way across the ballroom to table 42. To her husband, sitting alone, his hand still frozen around his second tumbler of bourbon, his face the color of old paper. And she had looked at him for one long, quiet moment. And then she had turned her face away. The applause in the grand ballroom of the Fox Theater had not stopped for nearly 3 minutes. People had risen from their tables and crossed the room to shake Imani's hand. The mayor of Atlanta had crossed the floor in his black tuxedo and had asked her, with a grin, when she would come to dinner at the mansion. 2 members of the Carter family had introduced themselves. A reporter from CNN had pressed a business card into her palm. Beverly and Crawford had asked, very politely, for an exclusive sit-down on Monday morning. Imani had accepted all of it with the same quiet grace her grandmother had taught her on the porch in Macon. Head up, shoulders back, slow words. The Lord is my shepherd. Roland had not moved from table 42 during any of it. He had watched, frozen, as his wife was surrounded by half the most powerful people in the state of Georgia. He had watched, frozen, as a young woman in a CNN polo took down notes. He had watched, frozen, as Beverly and Crawford handed Imani a business card. And somewhere in the middle of all that watching, his mind had finally, fully, caught up to what was happening. Brooks Heritage Orchards. The peaches at every centerpiece. The wooden crates, with his wife's grandmother's handwriting. He had eaten those peaches at fundraisers for years. He had not known. He had never bothered to know. At 10:15, when the crowd around Imani had finally begun to thin, Roland had stood up from table 42. He had crossed the carpeted floor of the grand ballroom on legs that did not quite belong to him. He had reached his wife just as Mrs. Tova Green was discreetly stepping aside to give the couple a moment of privacy. He had stopped in front of Imani. He had looked at her for a long moment. He had opened his mouth to speak. And before he could get a single word out, Imani had said, very quietly, "Roland, not here, not now." She had said it without anger. She had said it the way a mother says no to a child reaching for a hot stove. Roland had closed his mouth. Sister Della May, who had appeared at Imani's elbow as if by magic, had said, "Brother Roland, you can call my office Monday morning. There are some papers you need to sign." She had said it like she was offering him a piece of pound cake. Then she had taken Imani by the arm and had walked her, gently and firmly, away. Roland had stood in the middle of the ballroom by himself, holding his empty tumbler, while the woman he had called boring earlier that afternoon walked off into a crowd of admirers, leaving him with nothing in his hand but a glass. Camille had not come back to the gala. She had taken an Uber from the Fox Theater to her apartment in West End. She had paid the driver with money she did not really have. She had walked into her apartment in her red dress and her painful heels. She had taken off the heels in the doorway. She had walked into her bedroom. She had sat on the edge of her bed. And then, for the first time since she was 16 years old, she had picked up her phone and called her mother. Her mother had answered on the 3rd ring. Camille had said, "Mama, I made a mistake. I made a real bad mistake. And I want to come home for a while." Can I come home? Her mother had said, "Baby, you come home tomorrow. You come home, and you stay as long as you need." Camille had cried into the phone for 10 minutes. Then she had washed her face. She had packed a small bag. She had set her alarm for 7 in the morning. And she had decided, in the quiet of her West End apartment, that she was done being the woman a married man took to galas. She was just done. At 11 o'clock, the gala had begun to wind down. The dessert plates had been cleared. The band had played its last song. The 700 guests had drifted toward the lobby for valet. Imani had said her goodbyes. Mrs. Tova Green had pressed a long, warm hug around her shoulders and had whispered, "Dr. Brooks, this is just the beginning. You and I have work to do. I will call you Monday." Imani had nodded. She had walked, with Sister Della May on her arm, toward the front doors of the Fox Theater. The same front doors where she had been turned away 4 hours earlier. The security guard who had stopped her had been waiting at the door. He had been holding his hat in his hands. He had said, "Dr. Brooks, ma'am, I am so sorry. I did not know. I did not know." Imani had stopped. She had looked at him. She had said, "Brother, you were doing your job. Don't you carry that with you. You go home, and you hug your children. We are square." The security guard had nodded. There had been tears in his eyes. He had held the door open for her. Outside on the marble steps, the warm Atlanta night had folded itself around her. The streetlights had been glowing soft and gold. Sister Della May had said, "Baby, where is your truck?" Imani had said, "2 blocks down in the public lot." Sister Della May had laughed. "Lord have mercy." The new chair of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation parked her truck in the public lot. "Come on now, baby. Let's go get it." They had walked, arm in arm, down Peachtree Street. Beverly and Crawford had watched them go from the lobby window and had thought, that is the photograph. That is the photograph for the cover. And on Monday, when she had filed her story, that was indeed the photograph that had run on the cover of Atlanta Living Quarterly, and that had been picked up by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and by NPR, and by the Washington Post. The new chair of the Peachtree Heritage Foundation walking down Peachtree Street arm in arm with her 66-year-old farm manager, both of them laughing in the soft October night. Roland had not gone home to the Buckhead townhouse that night. He had checked into a hotel on Spring Street. He had sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time. He had thought about calling Camille. He had not. He had thought about calling his mother, Mrs. Henrietta Pierce, who lived in a brownstone in Inman Park. He had not done that either. He had thought about Imani. He had thought about the way she had looked at him from the podium. He had thought about the way she had said, Roland. Not here. Not now. And somewhere in the small hours of the morning, sitting alone in that hotel room on Spring Street, Roland Pierce had finally understood, with the kind of cold clarity that comes only when a man has lost something he did not know he had, that he had been married to a remarkable woman, and that he had spent 11 years failing to see her. At 3 in the morning, his phone had buzzed. A text message from a number he did not recognize. He had opened it. It had been from his mother, Mrs. Henrietta Pierce. The text had read, "Son. Your Aunt Yolanda called me at midnight. The whole family has seen it. I have seen it. We will talk on Sunday. But I want you to know before we talk that I am ashamed of how you have treated that girl. Your grandmother and I raised you better. You go and you make this right however you can. But you understand, Roland, that what happened tonight has been a long time coming, and your wife does not owe you a thing." Roland had read the message twice. He had set the phone face down on the nightstand. And in the dark of that hotel room on Spring Street, Roland Pierce had cried for the first time since he was 9 years old. He had cried for a long time. And as the first soft gray light had come in through the hotel window, he had begun, very slowly, to understand what he was going to need to do. Sunday morning had come soft and clear over Macon, Georgia. The peach trees in the orchard had been heavy with the last of the late-season fruit. The October air had been cool and sweet. Imani had woken up in her grandmother's old farmhouse just after 6, with the sun coming through the lace curtains and Joel asleep on the bed beside her in his Spider-Man pajamas. Sister Della May had been already up, downstairs in the kitchen, frying bacon. The whole house had smelled like home. The Atlanta Gala, in the soft morning light, had felt like something that had happened to somebody else, in another life, very far away. But it had happened. The proof had been on the front page of every newspaper in Georgia. Imani's phone had been buzzing on the bedside table since Saturday afternoon. Reporters, Foundation board members, an old professor from Emory, a producer from the Today Show, a pastor from a small church in Albany who had received one of the Foundation's grants and had wanted to say thank you. Imani had not answered any of it. She had been doing what her grandmother had always done after a hard week. She had been resting. She had been with her boy. She had been in her own kitchen, in her own house, in her own orchard. The rest could wait until Monday. Joel had woken at 7:30. He had blinked at his mother with sleepy brown eyes. He had said, "Mama, Sister Della May says you are famous now." Imani had laughed. She had pulled him close. She had said, "Baby, I am not famous. I am just doing the work your great-grandmama left me. That is all. You hear me?" Joel had nodded.
He had thought about it.
He had said, "Mama, can we go look at the trees today? I want to see if the new ones are blooming." There had been a new section of the orchard that Imani had planted the previous spring, 20 young trees of a heritage variety that had not yet been named. Imani had been waiting to name them. She had not known, for a year, what she wanted to call them. After breakfast, she had taken Joel by the hand, and they had walked together out to the new section. The young trees had been small and green and full of promise. Joel had moved among them carefully, the way he had been taught to move among trees by Sister Della May since he was old enough to walk. He had stopped in front of one of the trees. He had said, "Mama, what are you going to call them?" Imani had looked at her son. She had looked at the trees. She had thought about her grandmother and about the cotton dress and about the marble steps of the Fox Theater and about the moment Mrs. Tova Green had taken her by both hands. She had crouched down beside Joel. She had said, "Baby, what do you think we should call them?" Joel had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "Mama, I think we should call them the Ruth Peach, after great-grandma." Imani's eyes had filled. She had nodded.
"Joel,
that is exactly what we are going to call them. The Ruth Peach. The Brooks Heritage Ruth Peach. The very first ones to ever be sold under your great-grandma's name." Joel had reached out and had patted the small tree gently, the way Sister Della May had taught him to greet a young plant. "Hi, great-grandma. I am Joel. I am going to take good care of you." On Monday morning, Imani had driven to Atlanta to meet with Mrs. Tova Green and the Foundation Board. She had been formally seated as board chair. She had set out, in her quiet way, a 5-year plan for the foundation. New grant programs for first-generation Black farmers. A scholarship fund at Spelman College for women studying agricultural economics. A youth program that would bring inner-city schoolchildren to heritage farms across Georgia. The board had voted to approve all of it. Mrs. Tova Green had walked her to her truck after the meeting. She had said, "Dr. Brooks, I have been waiting 8 years to work with you in the light. I cannot wait to see what we build." Imani had hugged her. She had said, "Mrs. Green, my grandmother would have loved you. She really would have." Mrs. Tova Green had cried a little. Then she had laughed at herself for crying, and they had hugged again. On Tuesday afternoon, Roland had come to the Buckhead townhouse with a small overnight bag and a key. He had walked through rooms that had felt, suddenly, like they had never been his. He had packed his clothes. He had not taken anything else. He had left the wedding photographs on the mantel. He had left the small wooden carving Imani had brought back from a soil science conference in Ghana 3 years ago. He had left his ring on the kitchen counter, beside a folded note. The note had said, "Only, I am sorry. I will not contest the divorce. I will take care of Joel for as long as he wants me to. I will be a better father than I was a husband. You deserve everything that is coming to you, and I am sorry it did not come from me." Imani had read the note when she had come home that evening. She had folded it. She had not cried. She had simply put it in the top drawer next to her grandmother's pearls, where she kept the things that mattered. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Henrietta Pierce had called. She had asked, in a voice that had been small for a woman who was usually anything but, if she could come to Macon that weekend, to see her grandson Joel, and to apologize to her daughter-in-law. Imani had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Mama Henrietta, you come. You bring whatever you need to bring. Joel would love to see you. So would I." On Saturday, Mrs. Henrietta Pierce had driven down to Macon in her cream Cadillac. She had walked into the farmhouse. She had taken Imani's 2 hands in her 2 old hands. She had said, "Child, I did not see you. For 11 years, I did not see you. I am ashamed of my own self." Imani had pulled her into a hug. They had cried, the 2 of them, in the kitchen that smelled like bacon and peach preserves. Then they had sat down at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Henrietta Pierce had shelled peas with her granddaughter-in-law for the rest of the afternoon, while Joel chased a chicken across the yard and Sister Della May sang under her breath in the side garden. Camille Reeves had gone home to her mother's house outside of Birmingham. She had stayed for 2 months. She had gone back to school in January for a nursing certificate. She had not modeled again. 2 years later, she would meet a good man at the hospital where she would be working, a quiet black man who was a respiratory therapist, and she would marry him in a small ceremony in her mother's living room. She would never come back to Atlanta. She would never see Roland again. But on the night she had married, her mother had said to her, "Baby, you remember that Atlanta night. You remember the woman in the cotton dress. You remember what almost happened. And you let it teach you, every day of this marriage, what kind of woman you want to be." And Camille had nodded, in her wedding dress, and had whispered, "I will, Mama. I will." Roland had moved into a small apartment in Midtown. He had kept his job at the real estate firm. He had begun, slowly, to learn how to be a father. He had picked Joel up every other Friday from Macon, and they had gone fishing, or to Braves games, or just to the park. Joel had not warmed up to him quickly. It had taken Roland nearly a year to earn the first real laugh out of his son. But he had earned it, and he had kept earning it. He had not remarried. He had told a friend once, over coffee, "I had the best woman in Georgia. I just was too stupid to know it. I am not going to pretend I am ready for somebody else." His friend had said, "Brother, that is the first true thing I have heard you say in 15 years. Roland had laughed, and he had meant it. Imani had filed for divorce in November. The papers had been clean and quick. She had taken the townhouse. She had taken full custody, with shared visitation. She had not asked for $1 of alimony. She had not needed it. She had moved herself and Joel permanently back to the farmhouse in Macon. She had hired a private tutor for Joel for the rest of the school year, and in the fall she had enrolled him at a small private school in Macon where his great-aunt Della May had once been a teacher. Pastor Eunice Holloway had blessed the divorce papers on a Sunday morning at New Mount Olive Baptist. She had said, from the pulpit, "Church, the Lord does not call us to suffer in silence. The Lord calls us to walk in the truth of our own lives. Sister Imani, you have walked into your truth, and the whole community is walking with you." The whole church had said amen. A year after the gala, the first commercial harvest of the Brooks Heritage Ruth peach had come in. Imani had stood in the new section of the orchard with Joel and Sister Della May, and the 3 of them had picked the first basket together. They had carried it back to the farmhouse. They had put it on the kitchen table. Sister Della May had cut one open with the same paring knife Grandma Ruth had used for 50 years. The flesh had been deep golden orange. The juice had run down their fingers. Joel had taken a bite. He had closed his eyes. He had said, "Mama, this is the best peach in the whole world." Imani had taken a bite. She had closed her eyes. She had seen, very clearly, her grandmother on the wooden porch, smiling. She had heard her grandmother's voice, soft and clear. "One day, baby, you are going to own something the world cannot take from you." Imani had opened her eyes. She had looked at her son. She had looked at Sister Della May. She had looked out the kitchen window at the orchard that her great-grandfather had planted with his own hands. And she had said, very quietly, "Grandma, I made it. I really did." Outside, the warm Georgia sun had touched every leaf on every tree, and somewhere in the new section, a single peach blossom that had no business blooming so late in the season had opened anyway, soft and pink and certain, like a promise being kept.